This week's Bible study is on Psalm 4, so please read through the psalm before you watch this video. Right away, this seems like a particularly honest and candid prayer. There's no beating around the bush. The psalmist gets straight down to the point about the trouble that he faces. Yet he also holds firm to God with great faith and deep hope. This prayer looks at trouble head on, but doesn't let that trouble diminish confidence in God. Verse 1 launches in very abruptly, just as so many of our own prayers do when we feel that we're in a desperate situation. Urgency does away with any tendency to try and flatter God or to pretend that things are okay really. The first two words are an imperative, a command. Answer me. God is addressed as God of my right. In other words, the one who is going to defend my cause. The second part of verse 1 briefly looks back to a time past when God has acted decisively to liberate the psalmist from a difficult situation. But then the final line of verse 1 goes back to the urgency of the first. The deep need of the speaker is made very obvious, but there is a tone of expectancy. The speaker has no doubt that God will come and be present and act to transform the situation. Verse 2 is a complaint, but not against God. The complaint is against the enemies and adversaries of the psalmist, and the issue is shame. The reputation of the speaker has been attacked, his honour has been trampled, lies have been told about him, and he now bears great shame. But this shame doesn't leave him alone in embarrassed silence. It causes him to protest. It hasn't undermined his self-confidence or his faith. He will not sit quietly while he is slandered, perhaps even in a court of law. When we get to verse 3, we understand why the shamed psalmist has not been silenced by his predicament. He expresses his self-confidence in a deeper confidence in God. This verse isn't addressed to God, but rather to those who are responsible for the speaker's situation. He confidently bears witness to the powerful reality of God in front of those who are abusing him. Manufactured stories and shame have no power when confronted with the power of God. And God takes special notice of the faithful, which here means that God is especially attentive and particularly responsive to the prayers of the faithful. So if we look at the first part of verse 1 and the second part of verse 3, they seem to belong together. The former is a plea to God that is spoken but not yet answered. The latter is a bold statement to human adversaries, a confident declaration that God hears and will respond. The extreme trouble that the psalmist is in still falls within his life of faith. That living faith and hope in God gives a different context to the trouble. The trouble is framed differently because the speaker knows that God is both faithful and powerful, and he knows that the trouble will not be the final word. God's powerful, responsive love and faithfulness will override all trouble. This is the ultimate truth. The next few verses 4 to 6, seem to be a bit of an interlude, not fully connected with the confident plea of the first three verses. Verses 4 and 5 have more of a teaching tone. They sound as though the speaker has briefly stepped out of his own complaint in order to offer advice to others who are concerned with troubles of their own. Strangely, the advice given is to ponder silently, to offer sacrifices and to trust God. The idea of being silent contrasts quite strongly with the action of the speaker and his loud call for God to come and act. But the suggestion is that in the midst of trouble, it is possible to remain silent if you have deep confidence in God's reliability. So it does in some ways echo the theme of verse 3. Verse 6 is a little bit of a mystery, as we can't really tell what the tone is supposed to be. We can't tell from reading it whether it's a bit sarcastic, criticising those who say when they ought to be confidently silent. And we can't tell if the speaker himself is to be counted among the many who say. If it's not an ironic statement, then here we have another petition to God, asking that God would powerfully tackle the shame and destruction that have already been mentioned. In verses 7 and 8, we find a resolution to the first 3 verses of the psalm. They confirm the trust and hope that was expressed at the beginning. They bring to a close the plea that was expressed right at the start. We read these verses believing that God has heard the prayer and responded to the need, and so what was an urgent petition is now transformed into a joyful statement of trust and confidence. God has brought gladness where there was trouble and need, and this is even greater than the joy the community feel at the harvest when food and wine are in abundance. Life has been transformed. Verse 8 is a statement of quiet and complete trust. The psalmist, who was so anxious and agitated at the beginning, is now utterly at peace and can sleep soundly. Sleep is a vulnerable state, but the psalmist has no fear of this. The final part of the last verse is addressed directly to God again. Although translated differently, the same Hebrew word is used here in verse 8 as in verse 5. In verse 5 it is translated as trust, and in verse 8 it is translated as safety. In both verses it could have been expressed as confident security. God is the only one who can provide this unfailingly. This psalm is the prayer of one in the right. It doesn't ask for mercy or forgiveness. It doesn't acknowledge a failing, but it only asks for the divine protection that is due to the righteous. The psalmist can lie down in peace in the sure protection of God, the same peace that is later declared in the greeting of the risen Christ. The psalmist may be deeply troubled, but all of that is contained and held in the framework of a functioning, living, trustworthy relationship with God. Even very serious trouble is held within the deep trust and hope that comes when life is completely and wholeheartedly devoted to the purposes of God. For further reflection, there are some questions you might like to ponder. Read through the psalm again 2 or 3 times, slowly and prayerfully. Think about any aspects of this psalm that resonate with you. Think about the kind of prayers that you pray when you are experiencing times of trouble. Are there any similarities with this psalm? Are you vocal or silent? How do you respond to the psalmist's deep trust and confidence in God, even when people are spreading lies and rumours about him? How do you respond to the way that the psalmist testifies to his faith in God, to the very people who are the cause of his trouble? Does trouble and concern ever keep you awake at night? Try memorising verse 8 to recall and pray if you're finding that circumstances are disrupting your ability to sleep. Offer to God anything that is troubling you today. And if you don't think anything is causing you concern, then think about a situation in the past when you have been in difficulties and God's presence and love has helped you through, and offer your gratitude to God.